60 years ago this month, the popular magazine Wireless World published a seminal article entitled Extraterrestrial Relays. 12 years before the first spaceflight, it laid down the principles on which communications satellites operate today. Its author was one Arthur C. Clarke. Well, now on BBC Radio 4, Heather Cooper visits Sri Lanka to find out about Arthur C. Clarke, the science and the fiction.
The first thing that strikes you as you step off the plane at Colombo's Bandaranaike International Airport is the heat, soon followed by the noise and fumes of congested traffic. It comes as a relief to arrive in a leafy suburban street. There, in a comparatively modest apartment, we find arguably the greatest writer of science fiction and prophet of science fact in the world today. He's renowned for his novels such as 2001, The Sands of Mars and Songs of Distant Earth. They've received virtually every science fiction award there is. But back in 1945, his submission to Wireless World met with a mixed reception.
I've heard since from the later editor of Wireless World that his boss handed him my contribution and said, tell this crackpot to kindly drop dead. And the assistant editor took it back and read it and said, I don't think this is completely crazy. I think we should publish it. And the editor said, okay, we will publish it then, but if it is crazy, you're fired. And of course, now they're very proud of it.
The paper was entitled Extraterrestrial Relays. Can rocket stations give worldwide radio coverage? It was a topic of frequent conversations at the newly formed British Interplanetary Society, but the first to publish was one of their founder members, Arthur C. Clarke. His rocket stations are now known as communications satellites.
It was back in 1945 that I did write the paper suggesting that satellites could be used for communications, specifically the satellite in the stationary orbit where it hovers over the same spot on the Earth. So I'm rather proud of that, though sometimes when I see some of the things that come down from satellites, I feel a certain kinship with the late Dr. Frankenstein. Because of my interest in space travel for human beings, and because at that time in 1945 the vacuum tube, or the radio valve as we Brits call it, was the only device that could do this sort of thing, and I was working on one of the most complex radars in the world, which had at least 1,000 valves in it, of which 2 or 3 could be guaranteed to pop every day. So I assumed that the communication satellites, or space stations, as I thought they would have to have a team of engineers on board. And I've sometimes, not very seriously, said that the invention of the transistor was a disaster for space travel, because we were still stuck with vacuum tubes. We'd have the shuttles going up and down every day.
So what was the trigger? What actually inspired you to take an interest in space?
I think what made me interested in space was, I'm sure, the old science fiction magazines, astounding stories, wonder stories. I had them all at one time. I don't know where they are now. I hope they're still around, because they'd be worth their weight in gold.
Did you have a favourite author?
I think possibly Olaf Stapledon is still my favourite author.
I'm looking at you now with this book of the Somerset landscape that one of our colleagues has brought to remind you of your home in Minehead. What was it like growing up?
You asked me about events 70 or 80 years ago, and I can't remember anything outstanding. I had a very happy childhood, and I wish I could remember some of the friends from those days, but they're all gone now. So I've nothing but happy memories of Minehead, and indeed of Somerset as a whole.
Arthur's younger brother Fred still lives in the region and remembers well their childhood together. I visited him at his country house just off the Taunton to Minehead Road.
There's always so much to do. There's always something happening, usually something going wrong to make life interesting.
And what did you do?
Oh, behave myself, more or less.
I don't believe that's true. I've heard rumours that you used to ride everything on the farm.
Well, anything that would carry me, including the horses, the cows, the sheep. Pig, I tried that once, but it's not very comfortable. The life was never dull.
But Arthur grew up in a very different way, didn't he?
Arthur's life was wrapped around books, and whatever happened, he had to have a book with him. I remember one of the jobs we used to get was looking after the milk, which was boiling, to make cream. So Arthur would be left to watch it and make certain it didn't boil over. Mother come back an hour later, and there's 2 gallons of milk lying on the floor, while he was still reading a book in his hand.
What would have provoked him to read science fiction in those times when science fiction wasn't generally available?
One of the reasons was that before the war, ships coming from America used to bring back piles of old science fiction magazines, and they used to be sold in Woolworths for 2pence a time. Woolworths was right opposite our school in Taunton. At lunchtime, Arthur would slip across there, pile through these magazines, try to get 2 or 3 that had a continuing story in them, and read them. There was also a W.H. Smith's across the road.
I have a rather vivid memory of this. In fact, it's rather embarrassing. But during my lunch hour as a grubby schoolboy at Hewish Grammar School, I used to visit W.H. Smith's, and there was a copy of the War of the Worlds there, and I read a few chapters every day. And I'm very grateful to the manager, Smith's, and I can still see him in my mind, who knew perfectly well what I was doing, and let me, read the book. I imagine it probably had to be burned by the time I'd finished it.
What about when he tried to launch you into space?
Well, we didn't actually go as far as that, though we did have somebody come and try to make a rocket out of an old milk barrel once, but it didn't get any place. Arthur used to make rockets. I remember one day a friend of his who used to build beautiful aeroplanes out of balsa wood, and they used to come down to the farm to try them across the fields. And one day Arthur explained to him that, now if I tied one of my rocket to it, it would go much, much further. Anyhow, after an argument, which of course Arthur won in the end, he tied one of his rockets underneath this plane, pointed it to the skies, and off it shot. Got halfway across the field, came down in a burning mess of wreckage. We didn't see our friend for weeks afterwards.
When you were a kid, I mean, there were 4 Clarke children. Did the other 3 of you join in with these experiments?
No, we kept as far away as we could. As a rule, there. He was always very intrigued with the moon, and he decided one year to draw the moon in all its phases. And each night, after he'd finished his homework, we'd rush out of the house where he'd got his telescope set up and draw the edge of the moon. He did this for 27 days. This was in midwinter. And on the 28th day, he was in bed with a bad case of pneumonia. And of course, being able to see the moon like that and watch the moon and see the different mountains appearing one after another gave him the ideas of stories on the moon.
He became known as Spaceship Clarke at school, but in spite of his interest in both space and science fiction, the young Arthur C. Clarke took a job in the civil service. But he was quick with a slide rule and made plenty of time, in working hours, for writing his first science fiction short stories. One of them was set on the moon and was a prelude for things to come. It was called The Sentinel.
I let my gaze wander idly over the mountain wall that covered the whole of the southern horizon, marching out of sight below the curve of the moon. I was turning away when my eye caught a metallic glitter high on the ridge of a great promontory. It was a dimensionless point of light, as if a star had been caught from the sky by one of those cruel peaks. It seemed to have an elusive symmetry.
The Sentinel was one of the ideas which grew into 2001, finding an artifact on the moon. The Sentinel was that basic acorn from which the oak tree grew. 2001, the book and the film, that was completed about 1968. We started work at Stanley Kubrick and I in 1964. Well, at that time, It was before the first landing on the moon, remember. There was a great deal of enthusiasm for space travel. I was at the Apollo 11 launch, and I can remember the Vice President of the United States saying, now we must go on to Mars. At that time, it did seem plausible that we would be doing all these things by the year 2001. Well, I'm afraid we are not going to have a space station like that in the film by 2001, but we will have it sometime in the next century.
There are many other reasons, maintains Clarke, for going into space, apart from inspiring films and satisfying human curiosity. Some of the benefits we can't even imagine.
We never know, of course, what the payoff will be. The analogy I've often used is this. If there's some intelligent fish arguing about, well, why should you go out on this dangerous environment, the dry land, some bright, enthusiastic young fish might give them all sorts of reasons for doing this, but they would never have thought of fire. And I'm sure that in space we may find things as important and useful as fire.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Of course, the moon landing was politically inspired, the rivalry between the great powers. That was why it happened as soon as it did. Otherwise, it wouldn't have taken place probably even by now. But in fact, it occurred maybe 50 years ahead of schedule. Well, one day we'll be very happy because we're going to go out into space and set up first research bases and later, I'm sure, self-sustaining colonies on all the planets. We will be becoming a space-faring civilization. And I think that's as important, really, as our emergence from the sea 500 million years ago.
Perhaps, if Arthur C. Clarke had been slightly younger, not suffered from polio, and had been American, he would himself have flown into space. As it was, he took up what he regarded as the next best thing, diving into the inner space of the world's oceans.
I realized that here I could experience weightlessness. The beauty of scuba diving is this feeling of complete freedom, getting rid of gravity. The only way you can do it now is by scuba diving or by going to space, and very few people will have the opportunity of spaceward. But anybody can go scuba diving.
Arthur's first experience of what seemed like alien life was diving on the Great Barrier Reef, where he'd gone to escape from his failing marriage.
I actually went to Australia first to do a book on the Great Barrier Reef. And on the way, in those days, of course, one traveled by steamship. And I stopped at Colombo for an afternoon and met one of the local skin divers. And he infected me with interest in the Indian Ocean. So with my partner, the late Mike Wilson, we came back in 56. And this is where the show ground to a halt.
Arthur has lived, I guess, most of his life now in Sri Lanka, and I'm sure that's influenced his fiction.
Science fiction writer Stephen Baxter has collaborated with Arthur on several of his recent books.
He wrote a book called The Fountains of Paradise about a space elevator raised up to orbit above Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka was a kind of literal setting there. But I'm pretty sure the kind of cross-cultural aspect that he's lived through has influenced his fiction as well. I mean, I do sometimes think we science fiction writers should get out more, Clarke has lived in at least two radically different cultures. And I'm sure just the compare and contrast exercise that's gone on in his mind has enriched his fiction.
The idea of building an elevator, literally, from the Earth's surface right up to the stationary orbit, 26,000 miles above, seems fantastic, but it's theoretically possible. And here's a very strange thing. The material that can make it possible is Buckminster fullerene, which is maybe 100 times stronger than steel in some of its forms. And here's a strange thing. Bucky Fuller was a good friend. When I recorded The Fountains of Paradise, he wrote the sleeve notes on the, remember them, 12-inch record, and drew a picture of the space elevator. Yet Bucky never lived to see the discovery of the material named after him, which will, I think, make the space elevator possible.
My God! He stepped back from the window. Then, bracing himself, he dared to look again. He was looking down on the distant Mediterranean from the face of a cylindrical tower, whose gently curving wall indicated a diameter of several kilometers. But that was nothing compared with its length, for it tapered away down, 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 until it disappeared into the mist somewhere over Africa.
The concept of an elevator all the way to geostationary orbit might seem impossible. But to call it impossible, according to Clarke, would be to fall foul of Clarke's first law.
Well, the first law, when a distinguished but elderly scientist says that something is possible, he's almost certainly correct. If he says it's impossible, he's very probably wrong.
Clarke's second law is more simple.
Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
And the third law states that the only way to discover the limits of the possible is by going beyond them into the impossible. But it's a path that Arthur himself treads very carefully, taking great care not to contradict the laws of science as we know them so far.
As far as I can, I make it absolutely, completely based on fact. And in particular, I never write anything which I know is scientifically erroneous, although I have made one or two errors through carelessness or ignorance on occasion. I sometimes extrapolate from known science into plausible science, but I'm very careful to be self-consistent, and also when I do that kind of thing, when I, let's say, fantasize to some extent, I usually have a note at the end of the book pointing out to the innocent reader, this is not yet known to be true, but it might be true.
One of the most contentious areas of science fiction speculation is faster-than-light travel. Without it, interstellar travel takes decades and the plot can, frankly, become boring. Clarke has, on occasion, bent the rules, or at least bent space on itself to set up a faster-than-light shortcut. That's something that brought him into light-hearted argument with one of the other great science fact and fiction writers of the 20th century, Isaac Asimov. On one memorable occasion in 1974, Arthur found himself introducing Asimov as the speaker to the organisation Mensa in London.
Ladies, gentlemen, and in case there are any robots or extraterrestrials present, gentle beings, I'm not going to waste any time introducing Isaac Asimov. That would be as pointless as introducing the equator, which indeed he's coming to resemble more and more closely. The rumor that there's a certain rivalry between us should have been put to rest, and once and for all, in my recent book, Report on Planet 3. For those of you foolish enough not to have obtained that small masterpiece, the dedication reads as follows. In accordance with the terms of the Clarke-Asimov Treaty, the second best science writer dedicates this book to the second best science fiction writer.
But Asimov was not going to concede so easily.
From here on in, I won't mention him at all. Let us instead talk about science fiction, which, after all, is what we both do. I, because I am a great writer, and Arthur, because he is a stubborn writer.
You're well known as the world's leading futurologist. Can you go back to what predictions you missed out on?
Microchip, which hasn't really changed anything but made it much more accessible and universal. I mean, I never dreamed that everybody would have this equipment on their desks that they do now. I don't think there's anything I missed out on that's taken me by surprise.
When I last interviewed you, we were talking about the web and the internet, and I said, I asked you
the World Wide Web.
World Wide Web. Now, have your views changed? Because I've got to quote you on this one. What you said was, why go to Niagara Falls when you want a drink of water?
Well, that is a problem of getting what you want and not 50 times as much. And it's a problem which I haven't solved myself yet, but I'm sure that anyone who has to do it, can be selective and pinpoint what it is they really need and ignore the rest. And I told you about my invention of the spam bomb, haven't I?
No, tell me.
Well, the spam bomb is supposed to blow up your computer if you send messages that the other guy doesn't want, Send back, your computer is about to blow up.
You've seen a lot happen in your lifetime. Are you happy with the rate of progress in space?
I'm delighted to have seen so much happen. I never dreamed that when I was a grubby Somerset farm boy, that even half the fraction of these things would happen in my lifetime, although I was sure they would happen eventually. but I'm quite satisfied with what has happened.
What about going to Mars?
Well, of course, we'll be going to Mars eventually, and because I think that's where the action may be. It does seem the only other place in the solar system where life as we know it is possible. Given enough time, anything will happen eventually. And the fact that it has happened is going to change everything about the future.
So you think that life can actually influence the future of the universe?
Well, nothing can influence the future of the universe more than life.
What do you think the effect will be on the human race when we discover alien life?
If it's remotely human, that'll be perhaps slightly reassuring. If it's totally alien, you can see all the local religions going belly up.
Moving to the very far future, I'm talking now not about travel in the solar system, but travel into the stars, into interstellar space. Do you ever think that's going to be possible? Because there are some real restrictions, such as the fact that you cannot travel as fast as the speed of light.
Yeah, well, that's why the first stages of interstellar exploration will be robotic. But human beings will go in suspended animation, or when their bodies began to deteriorate, to just transfer their thoughts, so their personalities could be immortal. You just save it on a CD-ROM and plug it in.
It makes it sound so easy.
Simple.
In conversation, Arthur often twinkles with a wicked sense of fun. But he has a serious, even mystical side too, particularly when he's writing about the long-term destiny of humanity in books such as his personal favourite, Childhood's End, written in 1953.
Countless times this day had been described in fiction, but no one had really believed that it would ever come. Now it had dawned at last. The gleaming, silent shapes hanging over every land were the symbol of a science man could not hope to match for centuries. For 6 days they floated motionless above his cities, giving no hint they knew of his existence. But none was needed. Not by chance alone could those mighty ships have come to rest so precisely over New York, London, Paris, Moscow, Rome, Cape Town, Tokyo, Canberra.
It's about the aliens coming to the Earth to help us go through a kind of gestation. Man is about to become Superman, and the aliens are there to guide us through this traumatic but wonderful transcendence. There have always been two poles to Clarke's writing. There's a pole which is a kind of practical pole grounded in the very near future, which the engineers respond to. So very real, very achievable, almost predictive. On the other hand, there's a visionary pole to Clarke's work about mankind's ultimate destiny, which is much more wistful and thoughtful, melancholy in a way because the timescales are usually so long. In a way, the visionary stuff is buried inside Clarke, I think. My personal belief is that he doesn't always know this stuff is there inside him himself, and it has to be dug out. Famously, Kubrick dug it out of him in 2001. So in a way, I see that movie as Kubrick's metaphor for Clarke's own mind, I think, a kind of exploration of Clarke's personality.
Clarke certainly has no time for organised religion. Indeed, in his short story The Star of Bethlehem is portrayed as a supernova that destroys a civilization.
Arthur I don't think he's been down on religion itself, and certainly not on spirituality, but he is against organised religion, which he sees as a divisive blight on the world. And I think that's led him to believe that he isn't religious, but I would say he is in a deeper sense, in a spiritual sense. So I think some of the impulses that have driven humans to religion in the past are very strong in Arthur C. Clarke, even though he may not realise it himself.
The papal nuncio here in Sri Lanka recently asked me that I believe in God, and I said no, but I'm very interested in him. But that doesn't mean to say that a feeling of awe about the mystery and marvel of the universe cannot be retained. That has nothing to do with religion at all. I'm very fond of quoting Andy Nehru. He once said, but I heard him say it here, politics and religion are obsolete. The time has come for science and spirituality. And I regard that as my guiding light.
Great science fiction in general, and Arthur C. Clarke's in particular, can seem bleak, even pessimistic. But, says Stephen Baxter, that reflects neither the man nor his philosophy.
Clarke's more visionary work tends to involve very long time scales, immense scales of space as well. And what does it mean to be optimistic or pessimistic on such scales? I think if I say to you that humans are going to die out in 5 million years, that sounds pessimistic. But actually, we've only been around for 100,000 years, so it's actually an optimistic viewpoint. We live in a long-lived universe, and we humans are going to be shaped by space and time. The universe will continue to unfold and show us new marvels in the future.
Nowhere is that visionary timescale more apparent than in 3001, the final Odyssey.
Though they were not remotely human, they were flesh and blood. And when they looked out across the deeps of space, they felt awe and wonder and loneliness. As soon as they possessed the power, they began to seek for fellowship among the stars. In their explorations, they encountered life in many forms and watched the workings of evolution on 1,000 worlds. They saw how often the first faint sparks of intelligence flickered and died in the cosmic night. And because, in all the galaxy, they had found nothing more precious than mind, they encouraged its dawning everywhere. They became farmers in the fields of stars. They sowed, and sometimes they reaped. As soon as their machines were better than their bodies, it was time to move. First their brains, and then their thoughts alone they transferred into shining new homes of metal and gemstone. In these they roamed the galaxy. They no longer built spaceships. They were spaceships. But the age of the machine entities swiftly passed. In their ceaseless experimenting, they had learned to store knowledge in the structure of space itself, and to preserve their thoughts for eternity in frozen lattices of light. Into pure energy, therefore, they presently transformed themselves. Now they were lords of the galaxy, and could rove at will among the stars, or sink like a subtle mist through the very interstices of space.
For us, for our home planet, and for life in the universe, what does the future hold?
Obviously, we're going into the future, and the future is still to a large extent up to us to determine. And I'm more hopeful now than I've been for many years.
Would you like to have gone into space yourself?
Well, of course I'd go like a shot. I mean, it's very exciting. I'm sorry I should miss all the real excitement in coming 50 years.
Arthur C. Clarke, The Science and the Fiction, was presented by Heather Cooper. The producer was Martin Redfern.